Question, thank you very much, Mr. President. President Obama, you bet. Question, first, back to ISIS and Iran and Syria. Your very own national counter-terrorism operation has found that despite all of the decisive defeats that the US and coalition have dealt ISIS on the battlefield, that they've expanded their threat worldwide to include as many as 18 operational bases. In the 6 years you've been dealing. Do you feel any personal disappointment that there hasn't been more progress? And in any discussions you've had with the US military and your intelligence agencies? Have you come up with any new ideas on how to deal or defeat ISIS? President Obama, every time there is a terrorist attack I feel disappointment because I'd like to prevent all of them. And that's true not just when the attacks are in Europe or in the United States. When you read stories about attacks in Lebanon or Iraq or Afghanistan or distant parts of the world that don't get as much attention. They get my attention because that's somebody's kid and that's somebody's mom that's somebody who was just going about his business, and mindlessly, senselessly, this person was murdered. So I haven't gotten numb to it. It bugs me whenever it happens and wherever it happens. And we are constantly pushing ourselves to see are there additional ideas that we can deploy to defeat this threat. Now, it is important that we recognize terrorism as a tactic has been around for a long time. And if you look at the 70s or the 80s or the 90s, there was some terrorist activity somewhere in the world that was brutal. And as much as I would like to say that during my 8-year presidency we could have eliminated terrorism completely, it's not surprising that that hasn't. Happened, and I don't expect that will happen under the watch of my successors. I do think that because of our extraordinary efforts, the homeland is significantly safer than it otherwise would be. Now, in some ways this is arguing the counterfactuals, but the attacks we prevent I take great satisfaction in. And I am grateful for the extraordinary work that our teams do. I don't think there's any doubt that had we not destroyed Al-Qaeda in the Fatah that more Americans would have been killed. And we might have seen more attacks like we saw on September 11th. And we have maintained vigilance. Recognizing that those threats still remain, those aspirations in the minds of these folks still remain. But it is much harder for them to carry out large-scale attacks like that than it used to be. What we have seen is that these lower-level attacks carried out by fewer operatives or an individual with less sophisticated and less expensive weapons can do real damage. And that, I think, points to the need for us to not just have a military strategy. Not just have a traditional counterterrorism strategy that's designed to bust up networks and catch folks before they carry out their attacks, although those still are necessary, and we have to be more and more sophisticated about how we carry those out. It still requires us to have much greater cooperation with our partners around the world, but it points to the fact that we're going to have to do a better job in draining the ideology that is behind these attacks. That right now is emanating largely out of the Middle East and a very small fraction of the Muslim world. Perversion of Islam that has taken root and has been turbocharged over the internet. And that is appealing to even folks who don't necessarily know anything about Islam and aren't even practicing Islam in any serious way. But have all kinds of psychosis and latch onto this as some way of being important and magnifying themselves. And that's tougher because that involves both changes in geopolitics in places like Syria. It requires cultural changes in regions like the Middle East and North Africa. That are going through generational changes and shifts as the old order collapses. It requires psychology and thinking about how do these messages of hate reach individuals and are there ways. In which we can intervene ahead of time. And all that work is being done. And we've got the very best people at it. And each day they're making a difference in saving lives not just here, but around the world. But it's a challenge precisely because if you're successful 99% of the time, that 1% can still mean heartbreak for families. And it's difficult because in a country, let's say, of 300 million people here in the United States, if 99.9% of people are immune from this hateful ideology but 0.1% are susceptible to it, that's a lot of dangerous people running around. And we can't always anticipate them ahead of time because they may not have criminal records. So this is going to be a challenge. I just want to end on the point that I made earlier. How we react to this is as important as the efforts we take to destroy ISIL. Prevent these networks from penetrating. You can't separate those two things out. The reason it's called terrorism, as opposed to just a standard war, is that these are weak enemies that can't match us in conventional power, but what they can do is make us scared. And when societies get scared, they can react in ways that undermine the fabric of our society. It makes us weaker and makes us more vulnerable. And creates politics that divide us in ways that hurt us over the long term. And so if we remain steady and steadfast and vigilant, but also take the long view and maintain perspective and remind ourselves of who we are and what we care about most deeply. And what we cherish and what's good about this country, and what's good about the international. Order and civilization that was built in part because of the sacrifices of our men and women. After a 20th century full of World War, if we remember that, then we're going to be okay. But we're still going to see, episodically, these kinds of tragedies. And we're going to have to keep working on until we make things better. Question, if I may, Mr. President. President Obama, you may only because this is your retirement. Question, I was hoping you'd. President Obama, but I hope it's not too long because. Question. President Obama, I'm going to be late for my birthday dinner. Question, you alluded earlier to the negotiations between the U.S. and Russia over some military-to-military cooperation in Syria against some of the militant forces there. Presumably in exchange for whatever Russian influence could be imposed on the Assad regime for a variety of reasons. Now, I'm sure you're not surprised that some in the military are not supportive of that deal. Some European allies think it would be a deal with the devil. What makes you so confident that you can trust the Russians and Vladimir Putin? President Obama, I'm not confident that we can trust the Russians and Vladimir Putin. Which is why we have to test whether or not we can get an actual cessation of hostilities that includes an end to the kinds of aerial bombing and civilian death and destruction that we've seen carried out by the Assad regime. And Russia may not be able to get there either because they don't want. To or because they don't have sufficient influence over Assad. And that's what we're going to test. So we go into this without any blinders on. We're very clear that Russia has been willing to support a murderous regime and an individual. In Assad, who has destroyed his country just to cling on to power. What started with peaceful protests has led to a shattering of an entire pretty advanced society. And so whenever you're trying to broker any kind of deal with an individual like that, or a country like that, you got to go in there with some skepticism. On the other hand, if we are able to get a genuine cessation of hostilities that prevents indiscriminate bombing, that protects civilians, that allows humanitarian access and creates some sort of pathway to begin the hard work of political negotiations inside of Syria. Then we have to try because the alternative is a perpetuation of civil war. I've been wrestling with this now for a lot of years. I am pretty confident that a big chunk of my gray hair comes out of my Syria meetings. And there is not a meeting that I don't end by saying, is there? Something else we could be doing that we haven't thought of. Is there a plan F, G, H that we think would lead to a resolution of this issue so that the Syrian people can put their lives back together and we can bring peace and relieve the refugee crisis that's taken place? And the options are limited when you have a civil war like this, when you have a ruler who doesn't care about his people. When you've got terrorist organizations that are brutal and would impose their own kind of dictatorship on people. And you have a moderate opposition and ordinary civilians who are often outgunned and outmanned. And that's a very difficult situation to deal with. But we've got to give it a chance. There are going to be some bottom lines that we expect for us to cooperate with Russia beyond the sort of deconfliction that we're currently doing. And that means restraint on the part of the regime that so far has not been forthcoming. Early on in this version of the cessation of hostilities, we probably saw some lives saved and some lessening of violence. The violations of the cessation have grown to the point where it just barely exists. Particularly up in the northwestern part of the country. So we're going to test and see if we can get something that sticks. And if not, then Russia will have shown itself very clearly to be an irresponsible actor on the world. Stage that is supporting a murderous regime and will have to answer to that on the international stage.